Welcome to The Favorites, the podcast presented by Bet365. We are part of the Action Network. I am Chad Millman, Chief Content Officer of the Action Network. We're in the heart of NFL offseason. We are about 100 days since the last game was played. We are probably a little more than 100 days till the next game is played. The NFL schedule was released yesterday. As usual, it doesn't matter what is going on. The NFL does something. The rest of the world takes second place. Joining us today to discuss the cultural ubiquity of the NFL, the future of sports betting as a business, how it is all commingling, how it is affecting us as fans, business experts, social media maven, impresario of the very popular Huddle Up newsletter, Joe Pompliano. As always, joining me for this conversation is my co-host, my companion, my compadre, my BFF professional bettor, Simon Hunter. Hello, Simon.
How we doing, Chad?
Brother, I feel like the NFL has perfected this. They've been leaking for the past month. Here's the Thursday night game. Here's the Brazil game. Here's some ideas of where you might get some new platform games. Then the schedule release comes out. It is primetime specials on 2 different networks. It is all anybody is talking about. It becomes a social media holiday for teams, the Chargers, the Patriots. People are going all in on this stuff. And it's the release of the schedule. And yet we are going to succumb to it. We're going to cover it. In the coming weeks, we'll be doing extensive deep dives into the schedule, how it should impact futures bets, how it should impact season win totals. The NFL is so good.
Yeah, and schedule talk's the best just because none of it really matters, right, Chad? All of us are right now at 1,000 win percentage. We're all winners at this point. So, yeah, Bears fans can look at the schedule, say they have 11 wins somehow with a rookie quarterback. Eagles fans look at the schedule. They're like, wow, we're going to Brazil, coming home to play a Monday night game, then a Sunday night game. That's really what we're looking for, right? Or the different lineups of games. And even Steeler fans who are close in my life, they have the worst 6 weeks I've ever seen, scheduling wise. So this is why people obsess about and care about it. But like you said, Chad, it's just, if you're a diehard fan, there's nothing better. Seeing your team, especially if you're a fan of, getting primetime games. If you're a Carolina Panther fan, I think the NFL tells you all you need to know about your organization when you have 0 primetime games. So it is fun where it's fun to punch down on these teams where it's like, look at you guys, 0 primetime games. The NFL is really letting you know how they feel about you. So yeah, always fun talking football in May.
I know we talked about this and we're going to dig into it more when we talk about win totals and futures, but the Texans getting all this primetime love,
Yeah.
boy, that's going to feel like an automatic fade. You just have to. As a reminder, the Favorites podcast is presented by Bet365. Bet365 doesn't do ordinary. That's why you get more boosts with them than with anyone else. Every day they power up the odds on hundreds of bets to give you a chance to win more. Bet365 boosts specific markets, your winnings, and even parlays, and they don't stop there. Keep an eye out for their biggest and best odds with the incredible super boosts. Check out the boosts and see why it's never ordinary at Bet365. Must be 21 or older and present in Arizona, Colorado, Indiana, Iowa, Louisiana, North Carolina, New Jersey, Ohio, Virginia, or 18 and older in Kentucky. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. Terms, conditions, restrictions apply. Catch every episode of The Favorites live on YouTube. For those enjoying on YouTube, don't forget to give us a like, subscribe to the Action Network YouTube page. All right, we set it up. NFL is basically a 12-month-a-year behemoth. Joe, your coverage of the NFL draft live crowds and bidding wars is a perfect example. Another example, Christmas Day, the league announcing yesterday 2 marquee games available to stream on Netflix for the first time. And you had a tweet. I want you to summarize the tweet because this is exactly what we're talking about. Why covering the business of sports directly impacts fans. Joe, tell people your tweet and how it's going to cost us.
All right. So the tweet was essentially just explaining how many different platforms and services you now need to watch the NFL. And the kind of overview of this is that the NFL, in my opinion, at least, has done a better job than any sports league in kind of like intelligently dividing up its inventory to maximize revenue without, overdoing it to fans mostly. But I think we're now kind of pushing that line of like what's acceptable and maybe isn't acceptable given what other sports leagues have gone through. But if you look at the schedule for next year, there's games on 11 different channels. You need 4 different subscription services. You need Netflix, Amazon Prime, Peacock, and ESPN Plus, which all have exclusive games you can't watch anywhere else. You need cable or YouTube TV or something like that to watch most of the games. And then you need Sunday Ticket to be able to watch everything, right? So if you add all that stuff up, you're looking at, what did I say? It was 800 or 950
$986.
$986, right? And look, maybe some people came back and they said, you don't need it all for 6 months. Okay, get rid of ESPN Plus after the month that you need it for the game. Get rid of Netflix if you really want to and don't have it already. Same thing with, Peacock. You're still looking at $700-800 for the year. Whereas we used to live in a time where all you really needed was a cable package and Sunday Ticket, right? You needed 2 things. And now what the NFL has done is they've seen that they can take individual games, marquee games, create these events out of them, like Christmas Day, obviously Thanksgiving, Black Friday, so forth, sell them to individual networks, get $150 million per game, depending on where they're selling it and when, and make a tremendously more amount of money than they would have previously by doing that to fans. And look, people say they're going to get oversaturated. There's going to be subscription fatigue. But they've been saying that for years, right? This has been happening for a number of years now. And the NFL arguably has only gotten stronger over the years. And I don't think that's going to be slowing down anytime soon.
Simon, I look at that number, $986. That feels like a steal. Think about all the stuff that we spend money on. How much of this stuff do we spend money on for $1,000 that we don't love as much as we love the NFL?
Yeah, I would say to Joe's point, the pushback are definitely going to be younger people that don't have that kind of money to spend on that kind of stuff, right? It's just like a struggle to get by, especially in your early 20s. Or the people who remember yesteryear, right? Where it's like they had the bunny years on their TV, and you got every game, unless it was getting blacked out, for free on basic cable. So I would say I agree that someone who loves it, I don't really mind it. Like, I like that it's become an event. Like that whole thing that Netflix is doing, I get why people hate it. I think it's kind of cool. Like, it's gonna be kind of crazy to log into Netflix Christmas morning and putting on the games or whatever pregame show they do. So yeah, Joe, definitely interested to hear your view of it, of a guy that's in this business. I'm an addict to football. They kind of know they can put it anywhere. I'm going to pay to get it. Is that most people's views, that if you're a diehard fan, you don't really care? You might bitch about it, but you don't really care.
Yeah, so I think there's 2 ways to look at it, right? Is what does it do for Netflix and what does it do for the NFL? The NFL is more interesting, but let's start with Netflix. Netflix is massive, right? They've reached a scale now where they have basically just as many users or subscribers in the United States and Canada as places like ESPN, right? They have 80 something million subscribers, which is tremendous scale. That's not even counting the 270 million subscribers or whatever it is internationally. So it's a massive platform now. They're able to go and negotiate these deals because the networks know that they're not losing, or the leagues know that they're not losing a tremendous amount of distribution. So I think that makes a lot of sense. The money obviously helps there. But for Netflix, you're basically guaranteed 20 to 30 potentially million viewers for a live event. You're going to do 2 of them on a Christmas Day. They now have an ad supported tier, but the beautiful thing about football is there's already ads built in. So whether you're on the ad supported tier or not, you're going to be getting served commercials. Those commercials, they're going to be able to charge hundreds of thousands of dollars, probably around, I don't know, $500,000 per 30-second slot. There's 100 slots. You do the math, they're going to make close to their money back on just ads alone. Plus, it reduces churn for them. They're already at 2%, which is an industry low. It'll get better than that. And they're going to add subscribers. Now, they probably won't add the 3 million subscribers that Peacock did, mostly because they're already a popular service and a lot of people have them, but it's going to help their business. The interesting part to me, though, is like, why does the NFL do this, right? We just talked about it. Could it lead to fatigue and oversaturation? They probably could have sold it to a network that they're already doing business with. I think mostly, though, that they want to be in business with Netflix, knowing what's coming down the road. So we all know that they signed these, the 10-year or 11-year deals, whatever it was, for about $10 billion a year in TV rights. The interesting part about that, though, is that they're able to opt out of those deals. At I think it's 2029 or 2030, they can opt out of those deals. And what I think they're going to end up doing is exactly that. I think they're going to end up opting out of them. What we've seen with the NBA specifically, who's negotiating their rights right now, is that the public market, investors in the public market, have essentially said that it's better to overpay for rights than it is to lose rights, right? If you're Warner Brothers, it's the investors want you to overpay for the rights, even if you're not going to make as much money, because it's important to have live sports and you can monetize it in different ways. It would be a disaster if their affiliate fees on cable went down because they don't have NBA, right? So I think what the NFL is looking at is saying that they're going to be able to multiply the amount of money that they get by adding all these distribution partners up in 2029 or 2030. And the reason for that is because they've continued to create events, right? So think about Thanksgiving Day, Sunday Night Football, Monday Night Football, Thursday Night Football. They do Saturday primetime games during the holiday season. They obviously have the playoffs, which they've sold exclusive. They have the Super Bowl rotation, Sunday Ticket, which is also up. And then the biggest thing about all of it is Roger Goodell has publicly said that he wants to add an 18th game to the schedule. The CBA is going to be renegotiated in 2029, which I don't think is a coincidence, lines up with the TV deal, right? So they're going to go to market with this offering that is substantially better than what the networks are buying today. Plus, they're probably going to hit the peak perfectly of where broadcast partners are willing to pay maximum wise versus the digital companies kind of equaling out that supply and demand. So I think it's really kind of like a chess move from the NFL of saying, we want to be in business with Netflix. We think they're going to be an important bidder down the road. Let's start with a smaller deal today. We'll see how it goes. And potentially 5 years from now, we could be getting a lot more money from them on the backside of this.
5 years is tomorrow. It truly is. Yeah. And the conversations for that will probably start 18 months out. So we're looking at, let's say, 3 years from now, we're going to start seeing stories from your newsletter and other people covering the business about the expectations for NFL rights. The NBA is going to sign a deal with somebody, some combination of ESPN, Amazon, NBC, or Warner, that will be for $7 billion.
Almost three times what they get right now.
3 times what they get right now. The NFL is so far and beyond more valuable than the NBA. You look at the franchises alone, like the value of an NBA franchise is about $1 billion less than the NFL.
Well, just think about ratings, Chad. The ratings in the NBA are essentially flat. They're stagnant over the last few years. Regular season is essentially flat. Now, they've tried to do a few things to add things. But if you guys think about, maybe you've talked about this on the show before, but Nielsen fundamentally changed the way that viewership is calculated a few years ago. And that's why you've seen everything kind of increasing over the years. It added a substantial amount of out-of-home viewership data to the totals. And the NFL, everyone else has benefited from that. But the NBA really hasn't, right? So you could kind of make an argument that the viewership is actually down compared to where it was a couple of years ago. Now, let's say it's flat. They're going to get a 3 times increase on a flat number. To your point, what does that mean the NFL is worth, right? If the NFL's numbers are tremendously up and now they account for basically all of the top 100 top broadcasts in the United States every single year, to me, that seems much more valuable than what the NBA is. And if they're getting a 3x increase, on a multiple of the number, it won't be as much, but it's going to be a significant more, dollar amount than the NBA is going to get.
The NFL draft had more first day viewers than any game in the Stanley Cup Finals, any game in the World Series, any game in the most recent NBA Finals. Simon and I cannot stop talking about the NFL. We have turned this podcast essentially into an NFL podcast, partially because that's what people are most interested in. It's also what Simon and I end up wanting to talk about the most. I don't see any limit to the NFL's ability to sell its product and capture the attention and imagination of sports fans. What is your take on a saturation point, tipping point, inability for them to sell more product?
Yeah, I really don't see it happening either. I mean, people have been talking about this for decades. There's this famous quote from Mark Cuban, I think it was probably a decade ago at this point, where he said the line like pigs get fat hogs get slaughtered or whatever it was. And he was saying that the NFL was getting hoggy because they were putting all these games on broadcast television. And that was a decade ago, right? And to our point earlier, the NFL is bigger and better than ever before. And I think what we've seen is that there was an appetite for the NFL 24/7, 365 from people in America. And now it's growing internationally too. But there's a few good examples of this. We just talked about the draft. The funny thing about the draft is that the NFL didn't really intend for it to become like this. I mean, they certainly obviously wanted it to be big and people to talk about it, but now they've developed this whole thing where they go on the road every year and they go to different cities and people are bidding to host it like they would the Super Bowl, which is obviously a great thing for the NFL. But that was really by mistake. I think it was Radio City Music Hall. They hosted like a Rockettes concert and told the NFL that they wouldn't be able to do it the weekend that they normally do it. And Roger Goodell and the NFL were like, okay, well, we're just not going to do it here then. We'll just, go somewhere else. Which is sort of an amazing story, but there's just so many other examples. Like even yesterday, I'm sure you guys saw the news. Hard Knocks is doing the off season now with the New York Giants this upcoming year. So now we have an off season show, we have a training camp show, and we have an in season show. I'm not even really sure anyone was asking for that, but they're certainly going to watch it. And there's a reason why they're doing it. There's content 24/7, 365 around the NFL. And I think the numbers have proven over the years. I mean, I think there's 9 or 10 games around Christmas week this year, right? So like, they can basically do whatever they want from a saturation standpoint, and they haven't reached that boundary yet of where people are either complaining or the numbers are turning down to a degree. Until that happens, I don't think it's going to stop.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make too, where, not that this sport's perfect, but I have family from England and I go to England a lot. And just seeing how in 2004, if I would try to explain to someone how big of a deal Peyton Manning versus Tom Brady was, no one in England, I'm telling you, no one at any pub would understand it all, but they would know NBA. If I talked anything LeBron James, people in that pub would know it. Now I do think it's a part of the expansion of, we talk Netflix, that Netflix QB show also is a big deal because people in other countries got to watch these guys behind the scenes, these lives and what they put into it. But I explained to my cousins over there, they don't really get it. I think Americans get it, where it's the perfect sport that every game is a playoff game. There's only 16 games when we were growing up, now 17. It's the perfect sport for that it's once a week and you can be on your phone with it and you're not missing anything, right? A 5-second play happens and then you have 40 seconds usually until the next play. For my generation, people talk all the time. That was a big deal because bam, you're on your phone, you're texting your buddy back about the play that just happened, whatever. You can't do that in hockey. You really can't do that in a lot of other sports, right? They're moving too quick. So your view, I totally agree with, where it's like people always want things to be peaking, right? And like I always keep saying this is the golden era of football because it feels that way because we have so many good quarterbacks, the most good quarterbacks in my lifetime playing in the league right now. But like you said, I'm just being naive, aren't I? Like it is going to keep getting better. It's going to keep getting bigger. Like people you talk to, what do they project out internationally? Because it is going to keep spreading, right? And we're playing football in Brazil this year. It's crazy to wrap your head around that. A football game will be played in a city of Brazil. What's your view on all of it, Joe?
Their teams and cities across the world are intentionally thinking about NFL games when building stadiums. Real Madrid is the perfect example. What they did there with the pitch, which is removable and sits underneath the stadium so they can play NFL games, is tremendous and transformative. And I think that's going to continue around other places of the world. But it's not even people I talk to. I mean, Roger Goodell has said this, that he thinks there's going to be a 16 game or an 18 game international schedule while he's commissioner, right? So we're talking about, maybe within the next 5 to at least the next decade, we're going to be having a full slate. That essentially means one game every single week, someone will be playing international. Now, this will be in London, Germany, Brazil, Mexico City, Spain, whatever. But it means that you're going to wake up, basically, if it's in Europe, you're going to see a football game at 9:30 in the morning. Then you're going to go to 1. Then you're going to go to 4:30. Then you're going to go to 8:30. Then the next day you're going to be at 8:30 again. So it's going to be a full day. They already own Sunday, and it's only going to become more popular because of that. And to your point, I think a lot of, when I talk to people across in different regions of the world that are primarily looking at other sports, they all fawn over the NFL. The NFL is like the most ridiculous concept to them ever, right? Because no one else plays it in the world, really. Like it's only the United States, and it's commercialized to no end here. I mean, if you think about the NFL, one of the stats I love to use is that the NFL will do about $20 billion in annual revenue last year or this year. That's more than the top 5 soccer leagues, Premier League, La Liga, Bundesliga, Serie A, League One combined. right? And if you think about how big soccer is on a global
Yeah.
scale, they have hundreds of millions of more fans, billions of more fans than the NFL does. Yet the NFL monetizes their property significantly better than those leagues do. Now, there's some structural advantages, and most importantly, it's in the United States, which is the world's biggest economy. But it just speaks to how big of a business the NFL is. And that's something that everyone looks at. Literally, I've talked to people at Barcelona and Chelsea and AC Milan and places like that. And all of them talk about the NFL, and they talk about the MLS in the same instance, because in America, the commercialization of sports is completely different than you would see abroad.
You raise a really interesting point. It's something we touched on a little bit before we came on the air. There's a great story in Sportico this morning about Bain Capital. In 2005, the NHL was coming off a lockout. It was a declining league. It was fading to the NBA and the NFL. And Bain Capital put together a presentation that basically said, we will buy the entire NHL for $4 billion. And every owner in the league stood up and applauded at the presentation. And they understood it to be a financial windfall for them. Ultimately, they decided not to do it, not because it was financially the right thing to do, but because they had such an attachment to their individual franchises. They just didn't want to let them go. Turns out 20 years later, a generation later, it was the right call. The average value of a franchise in the NHL is about $1.3 billion. Clearly, the $4 billion would have been a discount 20 years later. And they would have operated it like MLS does. And sort of there was an economy of scale there for the people buying it. But the point is, now private equity is becoming a bigger and bigger part of investment in sports. We see it in the NBA. We see it in the NHL. We don't see it in the NFL, where it's prohibited still. But I feel like private equity, in the same way that sort of in a much smaller scale, streaming impacts the sports fan experience. Why should fans care, Joe, if private equity is investing in sports at the scale that it's investing in it? Because we have the biggest economy in the world, and sports as a product seems to have no limit.
So there's a few different points to this. I think mainly the NFL is going to approve it at some point. There's reports that it could happen as early as next week when they vote on it, but so definitely within the next couple of years, I would say for sure there's going to be private equity investors within the NFL. And the main reason for this, why the NBA did it and why some other leagues have done it too, is sports teams are just getting too expensive for individuals, right? If you think about the owners, there's certainly enough billionaires in the world that want to buy a sports team where that's not really going to be a problem right now. One of the bigger problems, though, specifically with the NFL, is minority investments. The problem with minority investments is if you take a team that's $3 billion, a 10% stake would be $300 million. Maybe you get a little bit of a discount, 20, 30% that would normally be there for an investor. But you're now paying $250 million for season tickets, right? Like you don't get to do anything. And I think there's a problem with that where your money's locked up for a long period of time. There's no liquidity and you get nothing out of it. So there's not a ton of individuals that, one, have the money to do that, and two, the willingness to do it as well. So private equity comes in there. And if you think about that divide, it's perfect for private equity, right? Because what do? You go and you raise billions of dollars from investors. You put it in an asset that's basically guaranteed at this point to increase in value, or has at least shown historically to be able to increase in value over a long time horizon. And you're able to charge 2 and 20 on that, which is amazing because your money's locked up. You know it's going to go up. No one's going to touch it. And you're able to charge a fee. That's like the best business model ever for private equity funds. So it solves both problems with the sports teams, their owners, the leagues, but also the private equity. There's immense interest from there. We've seen that in the NBA. But there's also a bunch of other things when you think about the fans that go into it. One of the good examples I like to use, and this wasn't necessarily private equity funded, but it can be in the future, and I think is what people will do, is we've seen this huge shift now where a lot of the owners are thinking about real sports teams as real estate companies, right? They're just kind of trying to build venues around their stadiums and arenas to maximize revenue and through real estate. And the best example of this, I think, is the Battery in Atlanta. So the Atlanta Braves a number of years ago moved from downtown Atlanta into the suburbs. It's about 20 miles away or 20 minutes away. And they opened up the Battery, which is essentially just a mixed use development around the stadium. There's hotels, restaurants, conference centers, office buildings, all that stuff. That space right now makes $60 million a year for the team. And that's a lot of money, first and foremost. I think it's their third biggest revenue line item on their expense, on their operating budget. But more importantly, this money doesn't have to be shared with other teams, right? So you have a structural advantage because it's local revenue that you get to keep yourself. So they do a really good job of it. The Warriors have done a good job. The Milwaukee Bucks have done a good job. The St. Louis Cardinals have done a good job. The Patriots have done a good job. Like all these teams are now doing it. And I think that's going to become more popular. And I also think it's something where private equity could step in and say, hey, we have experience doing this in some real estate deals that we've done in the past, but we can also provide investment capital that you need to go build this out rather than taking on additional LPs to go do that and raising money or doing capital calls or things like that. So there's a few different things where I think it could benefit the fan. But ultimately, I think the most obvious thing is that there's not enough owners. If the prices want to keep going up, you have to add more demand. And the best place to do that is from these deep pocket private equity investors.
A buddy of mine used to be a banker, and he worked on a deal for someone to buy an NFL team. And I once asked him, it's one of my favorite stories. I once asked him, so what happens? Like when someone buys the team, how do they pay for it? And he's like, you get a check. And I'm like, so you just get a check? He goes, yeah, I got a check for $1 billion. Like, imagine drawing that from your account. You're writing a check for $1 billion to buy an NFL team and just handing it over someone. By the way, that guy started a private equity fund and is now raising money to invest in teams. Simon, speaking of money, can you name the fastest growing ticketing app in the United States?
Game time.
That's right. It's Game Time. I love Game Time for two reasons. First, they still sponsor this show. Second, I use Game Time all the time. They have amazing last minute deals, including on pro and college sports. Speaking of which, I'm using Game Time right now. I'm opening the app from my house here in central Connecticut. Guess what? I could go to see the Yankees for $70, or I could go see Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever take on the New York Liberty for less than $100 this weekend. No matter where you live, download the Game Time app, get out, have some fun this week. You deserve it. If you redeem code favorites for $20 off, you can redeem code favorites for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, just download the Game Time app, use code favorites for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. Joe, the elephant in the room when you're on a podcast that is focused on betting is the impact all of these betting companies have had on the sports business, the sports media business. It's not discussed as outwardly in terms of the tangible impact it has on rights, the tangible impact it has on the economy of sports. Everyone just sort of says, yeah, people are watching more sports. The sports betting companies and sports betting as a business has made it more valuable. Give me your take on what you think the tangible value of that is in the context of the conversation we're having for rights.
I think there is a tangible impact for sure. The difficulty is measuring what that actually is, right? The easiest answer is that if you bet on a game, you're probably going to watch that game and you're more likely to watch that game. So I think that it's certainly impacted the NFL and other things like that. But I also think it's had an impact on smaller sports properties that maybe people didn't go and watch previously that now they're betting on and will go watch. So from like a percentage standpoint, it probably impacts smaller properties to an outsized degree. But to the larger point, people are betting more now than they ever have. It's becoming legal in more and more states every year, it feels like. And it is a big business and it's going to become a bigger business. And I think that the leagues are currently trying to figure out how best to maximize that exposure by partnering with betting companies and getting a piece of the pie while also not overdoing it, right? And a good example of this is the NBA a few months ago decided that they were going to build out functionality within their app where you can bet live on games, right? So you see the odds right within the broadcast, you click on it, it sends you through to one of the providers or one of the sports books and you place the bet. And like that felt like one of those things to me that was probably like just crossing that line of like, no one really asked for this. Why are we doing this? And to their credit, right, you had to turn it on, you could turn it off, you didn't have to have it on the screen. But I think those are like the examples that we'll see going forward of how do you partner with some of these sports betting companies and make sure, the NFL loves to do this. They want to make sure that if you're working with them, they get a piece of the pie. But how do you do that in a tasteful way? And I think another good example of this is like what all these sports leagues have done with Fanatics, right? If you think about Fanatics, people love to complain about Fanatics online, but none of these leagues are ever going to switch from Fanatics because they all own equity in Fanatics, and that money has gone up over the last number of years, right? So it was like this genius kind of decision and fundraising by Ruben and all those guys at Fanatics. And I think that's what these leagues are now trying to figure out is like, if you're the NFL, you have equity in data providers. You have equity in the commerce companies. You have equity in Noble, who did the uniforms for the NFL Combine. Like those are the agreements that they're really looking for to be able to maximize their share of the value that they're bringing to the table, right? Why would you just allow one of these sports betting companies to come in and monetize your content without you getting a share of it? And it feels like that's going to be the discussion over the next few years of like how they navigate that space versus more just people are betting on games. The sports books are making a lot of money.
Now, are the players in all these leagues benefit from this money yet? Or is this still just the owners getting all the money where, you know, the players aren't, maybe they aren't too keen to what's happening and how much everything's shifted, or maybe they just don't know what to do because like you just said, this is so much money poured into these leagues. And it's not overnight, right? This has been a slow burn these last couple of years. So are the players getting any kickback in these different leagues, or is that still not really, you really can't tell yet?
Well, they're definitely getting some kickback because basically all the leagues at this point have signed sports betting sponsorships and get paid money from it.
Right.
And if you think about the big four sports leagues, they all have revenue sharing agreements with the players. So the players get 50% give or take of any dollars that the league makes. So if they go out and they sign a deal for $100 million, the players get 50 million of that, which is great. And I think part of the reason why they're ultimately okay with a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
The thing to watch though is like, scandal wise, it feels like there's one every week now.
Yeah.
And
that's what I was trying to get to.
Yeah, like it's only going to become more popular though, right? Like you're putting this stuff in people's face. And granted, like I'm pro legalization. I think it's great. I think people should have the ability to pick and choose what they want to do. I always saw it as sort of like a low form of entertainment, right? If you're betting a responsible amount of money on a game, you're watching the game with friends, you're talking about it, great, fun. There's obviously people that take it a little bit too far, and players specifically who can't control what they're doing and do things that they're not supposed to be doing. So I think that's only going to become more popular. Greed is obviously something that's been around for a long, long time. But to your point, like the players, they should be okay with this stuff because they're going to make money on it. And it's the same reason why I talk about the NFL. They're going to be okay with an 18th game as well, because there's, for every Patrick Mahomes in the league that doesn't need any more money, there's 50 guys that are on practice squad and want to make more money. And the union is responsible for all these guys. So they end up negotiating deals that ultimately bring in the most money in spite of player safety or things that maybe the star players don't want to do. So with gambling, it's the same thing of where these unions are going to negotiate deals where they get a higher percentage of these rights going forward or of these deals going forward. And the leagues are going to continue to monetize it in whatever aspect they can to make the most money.
It does feel like a spot where players can use leverage with the betting companies. It's a spot where the players can use their leverage because of betting in ways that are different than they can do with even apparel or with media rights, which is there's a lot of animosity towards the players from amateur bettors who don't really know how to manage it, right? We hear it all the time from the players about the player props. We hear it from the players about totals. We hear it about sides. They are hearing about it, and they've heard about it for years because of fantasy too.
Yep.
But this all of a sudden feels like a place where players could use leverage to negotiate potentially better terms for themselves, specifically when it comes to betting. The NBA if the NFL wants to add an 18th game, then the players in 2029 should be saying, okay, when it comes to betting deals, we want 60%, not 50%.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things to keep in mind, I was talking to a very prominent investor out in LA who actually used to own part of an NBA team. And he was saying that the thing that concerns him the most, specifically with the NBA, but other sports league as well, is going forward, you almost have to build out in your models as an owner the chance that some of these players may get phantom equity in franchises, right? And in the league overall. Now, the NBA has taken a step towards this with allowing players to invest through a fund in different teams. So the same way a private equity firm could go in and buy 5% of a team, they're opening a fund where players can invest their own money and appreciate or join the appreciation of the teams. But I think to the larger point, what we've seen is, I mean, if you look at Live Golf, that's a good example of an institution that just came in with basically an unlimited budget and offered players something that the outstanding league or the existing league couldn't compete with, right? The PGA Tour, you don't get paid unless you show up and you play well. In Live Golf, you get guaranteed money because they're not worried about making a profit. Now, could that happen in the NBA? I doubt it, but it certainly could to some degree. But I think the bigger concern is what happens from a CBA perspective if the NFL or the NBA or leagues like that want to play hardball and the players and their union aren't up for it. Because I think specifically with the NFL, a lot of people have criticized what the union has done over the years. But even just being at 50-50 revenue sharing, I think is a tremendous kind of upside. The unfortunate part is that the owners are always going to be on top of this, right? They own equity in the franchises and there's a salary cap. So that's going to continue to rise in parity with the overall revenue of the league. But it also places a cap on player earnings. So we're seeing the same thing in the Premier League today of like they're trying to fight the salary cap because there's entities and institutions and people that will spend money if given the chance. And if you look at the NFL, it's a very small percentage of about 50% of the money gets spent on the players. For teams in the Premier League, it's like 90% for the top teams, right? They're spending 80-90% of overall income on players every single year. So the US and specifically the NFL has the best business model in sports where you have this limited inventory. Every game is super important. They're all sold at the broadcast level. You have the sports betting and everything else. There's a reverse draft. So there's, new competition every single year. And I think sports betting, to your point, is just a extension of that.
The NBA recently had the Jontay Porter controversy scandal where he's been banned from the league for betting on his own player props. Now there are conversations about how to manage that, how to manage player props individually. This isn't really a business question, although I feel like it's related to the business in that if you are a business trying to manage the fine line between conflict, integrity, and maximizing revenue, how do you, as someone who is in this space and very attuned to optics, help them manage this situation?
It's zero tolerance, right? And that's why Jontay Porter's ban was the easiest ban of all time. He's a two-way player. He's not important to the overall league. He bet on games. He bet on games that he was playing in, and he bet on his team to lose. It's like, that's a slam dunk. You're getting banned. No questions asked. No one's going to complain. No fans are going to ask questions. Easy, done. And I think that's the kind of stuff that hopefully will scare other people into not doing similar things. But look, there's no doubting that there is some kind of hypocrisy here where the league is saying, people make jokes every time one of these things comes up. Jontay Porter investigation brought to you by FanDuel or DraftKings or whatever, because that's what the league is doing. And I think what the players need to understand is what we talked about earlier, which is like, you guys are benefiting from this financially. The league isn't just making money and you guys are not getting a share of it. No, this is helping you guys, but there's specific rules that you have to be able to abide by for us to make this money that you're going to end up getting 50% of. And part of that is not betting on games. It's keeping the integrity of the game important. So to answer your question, I think it's just having zero tolerance. It's lifetime bans. It's multiple year suspensions. The NFL has done a pretty good job of setting guidelines, very strict guidelines of, hey, if you do this, this is what the punishment is going to be. It fits within this label and that's what's going to happen. And they've had to apply that, more than a handful of times at this point. But I think the hope is over time, as more players get educated and they do more kind of learning around this stuff, that hopefully that number goes down. Now, the big concern for the leagues is if there's like a bigger scandal, right? Jontay Porter, it's like, okay, this two-way player is betting on his props he's coming out of the game with injuries. it was obvious what was happening. I forget the exact number that he was betting, but it was like, totally outsized to what you would bet on a normal prop, but specifically on a Jontay Porter prop, it was, outrageous. Those things are easy to catch and not meaningful to the overall game, I would argue. The bigger ones are like, are some of these games potentially going to be fixed in the future? Are there going to be star players that are important to the league that make a dumb decision and impact ratings or kind of controversy and things like that? And those are the things that the league should be more concerned about rather than just, the props. I think you guys probably know this better than me, but there was an article a few weeks ago about, I think it was the NBA was specifically talking about limiting props or maybe taking them away altogether. Which, I don't necessarily think that's the best idea. There's plenty of people that like props and there's businesses that have been built on that gameplay style. But I would argue you probably don't need Jontay Porter props, right? Or again, you can limit them to a number that's not substantial and would make it so no one wants to fix the game or risk their multi-million-dollar career because of it.
Yeah, if people want peace of mind, there is no event in America, no sporting event in America that can be fixed for, say, 7 figures without millions of red flags now exploding everywhere. The Super Bowl is the only thing you can maybe get enough money down with enough people that would be advantageous to these different players to even consider fixing the game. But I mean, we all agree, right? It's the quarterback really is, unless it's the referees, that's a whole nother story. But I just want people to have peace of mind knowing it's impossible. I mean, we just talked about
but
a
I don't
two-way
know
player,
if I
nobody
agree.
got
I don't
caught.
know if I agree with that though, right? Because so Jontay Porter, I agree in the fact that he probably couldn't have fixed the game. I don't think he was an important enough player and kind of in the grand scheme of the game plan to be able to do that. But
Even if he tried, he failed.
yeah, he did. But he did it. He did it for much less money than you are arguing people would do it for, right? Like he just made a dumb decision.
Right.
He was essentially going to make like 15 grand on a game. Like that's idiotic in the grand scheme of his career and how much money he was making for being on the Raptors. So the idea that you have to get 7 figures down, if you were smart, yes. But the fact that he was doing it for, $15,000 is one, idiotic, but two, it leaves a little room for interpretation on what players would be willing to do it for.
No, you're definitely right. Like if a backup quarterback somehow knew he was playing that week and no one else knew, and he's like, I am going to shit this bed. I have not studied. I am unprepared. I am terrible. He could go out and tell all of his friends and get maybe a bunch of money down against him. But these books now, like bettors know, man, even if I'm trying to get a small bet down midday, $2,000, someone's getting called. Like it's and they have facial recognition. Like I talk to Chad all the time. I wear masks now to sports books because the minute I walk into our sports book, I'm escorted out because the cameras pick up your face and they have the technology now where they're like, oh, they know exactly who I am. My social security number pops up, the whole 9 yards. So I'm agreeing with you. Actually, you made a good point there. That guy with Toronto, that's the definition of having a sickness, right? He had the disease because there is no logical reason behind it. I was mainly talking about, people are like, what if Patrick Mahomes threw a Super Bowl, whatever, like all these crazy speculations. It just wouldn't make sense. The guy gets paid $50 million. Like there's no, unless the mafia has his wife and kids, there's no scenario. So people all the time say these crazy things. Me and Chad joke about it. Oh, the script got leaked, right? The game script. We know what's going to happen. We're just having fun, people. It's not, people act as if these things are all scripted. It's really not, people.
You could make the case if we were conspiracy minded that Jontay Porter ended up being a patsy for all of this. That somehow you couldn't find a better example. Ban a two-way player for player props that don't really impact the game. You send the message, you make it clear there's a no tolerance policy. Mid-level players making $2 million a year who might be overspending and looking for easy ways out. All of a sudden, they're not looking for that out because they know the league is going to come down on them because they saw what they did to Jontay Porter.
Yeah, that's basically what I was saying, right? It was like almost helpful for the NBA that it happened because right out the gate, you set an example of what's going to happen if you go do that. And it's not a player that really matters in the grand scheme of the game.
No. All right, Joe. Thanks for coming on, brother. Joe Pompliano, author of the Huddle Up newsletter. Great follow on social media when it comes to sports business. Look, this is not a beat that's going away. It's going to impact us as fans more and more as the future evolves, whether it's sports betting, streaming rights, ticketing, investment. It all trickles down to us, folks. Every single element. As a reminder, the Favorites podcast is presented by Bet365. Bet365 doesn't do ordinary. That's why you get more boosts with them than with anyone else. Every day they power up the odds on hundreds of bets. To give you a chance to win more, Bet365 boosts specific markets, your winnings, and even parlays. They don't stop there. Keep an eye out for their biggest and best odds with the incredible Super Boost. Check out the boost and see why it's never ordinary at Bet365. Must be 21 or older and present in Arizona, Colorado, Indiana, Iowa, Louisiana, North Carolina, New Jersey, Ohio, Virginia, or 18 and older in Kentucky. Gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER or 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. Terms, conditions, restrictions apply. Simon and I will be back with our next episode of The Favorites on the Action Network YouTube page, Tuesday, 1:45 p.m. Eastern. Download us from Spotify, Apple Pods, wherever you get your pods. Rate, review, subscribe, leave us 5 stars, say whatever you want. Feedback is a gift. Until Tuesday. Love you.